Hello, welcome back to our course on early modern philosophy. We have been talking about how early modern philosophy connects to ancient Greek philosophy, and now we want to go a little more into medieval philosophy, the philosophy of the Middle Ages, which also is hugely influential for early modern philosophy. So philosophy does not begin and end in a vacuum. It's connected to the philosophy that came before it, and it leads to the philosophy that come after it. And the whole history of philosophy, if you see it in this way, is a long chain of thoughts that are connected, that are answering each other. Every philosopher is answering to another philosopher, and this is how this comes about. So in the philosophy of the Middle Ages, there are again many different periods, many different philosophies. The Middle Ages, perhaps goes from roughly 500 to 1500, so it's about 1,000 years. And of course, within this 1,000 years, the world has changed significantly, and the philosophy also has changed with it. I'm not a great expert in medieval philosophy, so we will not go into details there, and we don't need it. But we need to understand where the early modern philosophers come from. So Descartes, for example, was educated in medieval philosophy, scholastic philosophy as it was called, which comes from school, right? The philosophy of the school, which is the school of Christian philosophy. And Descartes comes from there, and his own philosophy is in opposition or a development out of scholastic philosophy. So in order to see where Descartes is coming from, it's useful to have some idea of what the discussions were in medieval philosophy. And one of the important things was the question of universals. This was something that was in the High Middle Ages a very important question around 1100 to 1300 AD we are talking about now, right? I give you some dates that are very rough on it so that you have some idea of what times we are talking about. And this question of universals was about properties that are shared by many individual things. So philosophers were thinking, okay, we have, let's say circles and circles around, and then the question is, where does the roundness, what is really the roundness of a circle, and where does it come from? Or the treeness of a tree. So you have a tree, and you recognize a tree. So how do you recognize a tree? You could say the tree has some property. It has a treeness, and this treeness is how I recognize it. But what does it mean? Where is the treeness? What is the treeness, separately from the particular tree itself? Is there a treeness that is in all things and that is separate from a particular tree? And if there is, how can I say what it consists of? And if there is not, then how do I even recognize a tree? How do I know this is a tree and this is a car? And this was what Plato's idea was, to say that there is an essential form of a tree or a form of a car which our soul knows from, some previous life. And there's a perfect world of forms, and the tree and the car are just shadows of these perfect things. And this is how we recognize them. But in the Middle Ages, there was a heated discussion about it. Where do these properties come from? And are they real? Are these universals, the treeness of a tree or the circleness of a circle? Are these real things? Or are they just constructs of the human mind? Is it just our minds that create these ideas? Or are they really there in the world? Is the treeness something that is somewhere outside and I can see it? And so Plato, of course, would say, there is a true world of universals somewhere, the world of forms, and these are existing. And we saw already that this, last time we talked about how this connects to Christian religion, right? There is the word of God, the perfect word of God, and everything down here is just an image of this perfect word of God. And this would be called the realists, because they think that the universals are real. There is a treeness, there is a circleness, there is a human beingness. But the other side of this, the other camp, right, would be the nominalists. And the nominalists say This is why they're called nominalists. The nominalists say that everything is just names. So nomen in Latin means name. Everything is just names. So when I say the circleness is not really a thing. The circleness is just a name that I give to these properties of the circle. I'm just naming a bag of properties and say that these properties now, I call them circleness, particular, let's say, shapes or particular geometric properties. Or with trees, the treeness of a tree is not something that exists in the world separately from the tree, but it's just something that my mind makes up, a collection of properties of height and the stem that is brown and wooden, and then I have the leaves and so on, and the crown. And whenever something has this collection of properties, I call it a tree. So the treeness is just a bag of properties. And these people are called the nominalists, right? So are those who say that the universes are not real, but they are a name, a kind of name that we make up. They don't exist. And this goes back to Aristotle's ideas about properties. Things have properties, but the properties don't exist independently of the things. And so this is the ancient divide again between Platonic, the belief in this transcendent world of perfect things, and the Aristotelian belief that everything is rooted in the world. And so the split between Plato and Aristotle, you can, still find it in medieval philosophy in the distinction between realists and nominalists. And later, you find a similar divide now in our period we're discussing in the early modern philosophy between rationalism and empiricism. Because the rationalists think that we can understand the world only with our mind. So, the best knowledge about the world is the certain knowledge I get from geometry, for example. Well, I don't need any observation for geometry. I know, the value of pi or any other geometric constant, or that a square has to have 4 sides, and all these things just with my mind. I don't need to observe a lot of squares. So this would be a rationalist thinking that the true knowledge about the world comes from the mind only. While empiricism is the idea that I get the best kind of knowledge about the world from observation. So I have to look at the world, and then by looking at it, I can derive some properties of it. And you see how similar this is to this idea of nominalism and realism. So if I think that if I am nominalist, I think that just the things themselves count, and my mind makes up these names for these properties, while if I'm a realist, I think that the circleness and the treeness are really in the world, and then perhaps with my mind I can somehow try to understand them. And so for a rationalist, the ideal kind of science would be a science that gives me knowledge about the world without needing observation. And this would be logic, mathematics, geometry, right? And the opposite view, if I am an empiricist, then I would think that I can obtain knowledge of the world only through the senses, or primarily through the senses. Our thoughts alone, the empiricist would say, cannot provide real information about the world. With my mind alone, I can perhaps say, okay, a circle is circular, but this is not much of a knowledge about the world, right? If I want to say anything real about the world, for example, where Australia is located, I need to find, a map or an airplane or some kind of empirical device which will, tell me where this place is. And this then goes back again in a different form, but in essentially, a similar kind of dichotomy between rationalism and empiricism in Plato and Aristotle. And even the pre-Socratics, you can go back there and find some who are more rationalist and some who are more empiricist in their approach. So keep this in mind as we go on, and you will see how the whole of philosophy suddenly makes sense. So it's not like you need to, often the history of philosophy is misunderstood as something where you need to remember a lot of names, you need to memorize all kinds of stuff. It's not the case. You don't need to memorize so much if you just try to see these big movements, and then suddenly all of it makes sense, because you realize how the one answers to the other and how the one is connected to the other. So thank you. And see you next time, where we will talk about the Renaissance and now how we go from the Middle Ages to this modern time where early modern philosophy begins. Thank you, and see you there.